not a dev. The stuff I've learned here has been through Googling and my experience. This is just roughly how I tune my tanks. The first thing to look at is your engine. For each era, the displacement of an engine determines the power curve. All 8-liter engines will have the same listed output at 1000, 2000, and 3000 RPM. The major difference will be the max RPM, which determines the maximum amount of power you can pull from the engine. Cylinder displacement determines the max RPM for an era. So a World War I 1-liter cylinder will have a max RPM of 1700. Keeping the same weight, doubling the cylinder count requires shrinking the existing cylinders by around a factor of 4, which means power only drops around half for any specific RPM, since we're doubling something 4 times smaller. Because we're now running smaller cylinders, you can get higher maximum RPM. Despite this, for equal weight, many smaller cylinders still produce less power than fewer larger ones. Weight and size scale the same for engines of all eras. 1 cubic meter of engine weighs 1 ton, and will continue to weigh 1 ton even going through the eras. Only max RPM and displacement power curves change between eras, except for late war, which could access to 5-liter displacement cylinders. It's notable that power at maximum RPM is unobtainable. Engines lose power when close to their limit, so listed horsepower is not accurate, but a higher listed RPM means higher effective RPM. So, TLDR, max the cylinder size, then add cylinders until you're satisfied with your horsepower. So now that we have the engine nailed down, we can work on the tracks. But we need to make sure the transmission will work properly. For this, we need to set the target minimum and target maximum RPM. The target maximum should be about 20% lower than the actual maximum of the engine, and the target minimum should be half that, at least until we tune the transmission, which we will want to put a healthy number of gears on. We will tune the transmission later. For now, set G1 to 4 and hit the G1 over N button. If you're redlining on max gear, add more gears. If you can't add more gears, lower gear 1 until you aren't redlining on maximum gear when driving around on the test area. We aren't going for top speed right now, we just want to drive around. There are a few things to consider with tracks. Of the most important is axle count. This is the main determinant in climbing ability, even over the transmission. Even if it looks like your tracks aren't getting enough torque, it's still usually a traction problem. And the easiest answer to the traction problem is more wheels. It's notable that more wheels on the same axle are worth less than more axles, as are thicker wheels. More and thicker wheels do add traction, but more axles are significantly better. You don't want wheels too small, since the track is purely visual. You'll have to rely on wheel diameter for obstacle clearing, both climbing the steps and jumping the trench. Simply put, if the obstacle is over the center of the wheel, you can't cross it, unless your forward force causes the suspension to raise the wheel, such that the center is over the obstacle. This debacle usually leads to inner-reef road wheels, multiple wheels per axle, or both. As for weight savings, idler and return roller should have the minimum thickness. You can put another wheel spaced out if that looks weird. Road wheels should also have the minimum thickness, unless the difference between you climbing a slope or not is less than a few centimeters. Now on to suspension. Short and long arm torsion bars are really the only things worth considering, with the former weighing less and the latter giving more ground clearance. As far as adjusting the torsion bar, one of the values should be 0. Lengthening the bar weakens it, and widening the bar strengthens it, so doing both is counterproductive, at least until a more realistic model is added. For strength, you want the suspension to hold the tank up when level, but yield as it goes down the platform. Resting angle may at first seem like it just changes the ride height, but it actually helps with obstacle clearing, since a steeper angle means that the wheel will raise easier when it cannot go forward. Be careful though, as high rest angles and small wheels can end up like ratchets. Almost any tank should be able to climb the 20-degree slope, and you'd be surprised when you climb the 30. If you added as many road wheels as you can, and it still won't climb, you may actually have a torque problem. Try raising the lowest gear. If you raise your first gear well past 5, you can try shrinking your sprocket, and if that fails, you just can't climb that slope. It happens. I was upset that I couldn't climb the last slope with my teabag entry. Accept the slope you can climb, and tune for that. For the sprocket, you want to make any final adjustments now, since changing the diameter by even a couple of centimeters can lead to transmission problems. A sprocket's diameter is as close as you can get to a final drive. Like a car's, messing with your final drive can change the vehicle's top speed. So, larger sprockets can go faster, or you can adjust the transmission. I've heard that there's some magic going on and larger sprockets increase top speed, but I remain unconvinced that gearing can't do the same. Now adjust your suspension and gearbox such that it just barely climbs whatever slope you can. You can do this by increasing the road wheel diameter until you can't climb it, then step back until you can. Do the same for your gearbox, and record that gear somewhere. You'll need it for later. Now we're going to find the max gear you need. It's time to hit the roadway. If your tank hits top gear, Lower your starting gear until it doesn't. Once your tank tops out without hitting top gear, raise the first gear slightly until it does. Now, you need to manually adjust the highest gear. Go up and down in small increments. You will likely find that the absolute top speed takes a while to get to, and it's often worth it to take a lower value for better acceleration. If you can't hit top speed before the end of the runway, it's not worth going faster. So now we have the lowest gear, which you've previously written down, and the highest gear, which you just found. We can now do the gear calculations. There is a calculator, but first an explanation of what we're doing. Right now, when you go out of second gear, you don't start at the bottom of third. There's a small overlap where it's correct to be in both gears, as Gear 3's target minimum is less than Gear 2's target maximum. We want each gear to seamlessly transition, such that Gear 2's maximum is equal to Gear 3's minimum. Or in other words, for any given speed, there should not be more than one gear in the target range that is correct. The calculation is simple. Take the ratio of the previous gear, multiply with target min, divided by target max. The function is an exponential function, with A being the first gear ratio, and B being target min over max. Of course, you need to select a target minimum that will let us go from our lowest gear to our highest gear. That's where my calculator comes in. To use the calculator, we need a first and last gear, the number of gears, and target maximum RPM. For the maximum RPM, we've been using a value 20% lower than the actual maximum RPM of the engine. But for fine-tuning, we're going to use a value 10% lower instead. We also need a gear count. If you remember from earlier, an engine power scales linearly with RPM, so we want to keep target minimum as high as possible. Unfortunately, this shrinks target range for each gear, so we want as many gears as is reasonable. I usually aim for 5 to 8 forward gears. After you run the calculator, put in all the gears and update your minimum and maximum RPM. Before we get on reverse, we need to go for another runway drive to actually make sure we can get into last gear. As we've raised our target maximum RPM, we will be getting closer to the top end limit on the engine, and it may not have enough power to reach the top of its second highest gear. There are two solutions to this. Both reduce acceleration, but in different ways. Firstly, we can reduce the number of gears. This means that we will go to lower revs, slowing acceleration down. But it also means the gear ratio of the second highest gear will give more torque. Secondly, we can reduce the target maximum RPM. This means we'll spend less time at higher revs, slowing acceleration down. But this cuts off the revs we were stuck at in our previous gear, forcing the engine to shift. It's notable that, with the second option, you'll probably want to add more gears, tightening the target range, or you'll also be stuck at lower revs. Once we get our forward gears down, we have to look at reverse. Since we can't change target min and max for reverse, we are stuck at the same ratio between gears. The simplest option is to choose a selection of gears from the forward ones. Choosing the lower gears means good climbing and fast acceleration, and choosing the higher gears means higher top speed. You can choose some of the middle gears, or even all the gears. Just make sure you're not leaving out gears in between, or your tank won't shift right. You can also make a whole new set of gears. Set a gear count in starting gear, and my calculator will generate a whole new set of gears that will work with the forward ones. Bye.